The document was 43 pages long. Archivist Prime Sevan had been cataloging captured human intelligence for 11 months, and in 11 months, she had learned one reliable truth about human documentation. It was always longer than it needed to be. Humans wrote in circles. They repeated themselves. They buried the same idea in 17 different paragraphs as though they were afraid the reader might miss it the first 16 times. So when the document arrived in the secure intake bay, transferred from a Dominion strike team that had raided a human military installation on Kepler's Reach, she assumed it was more of the same. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about almost everything. The document had no title. That was the first thing that made her pause. Human military files always had titles. Long ones, usually, full of acronyms and department codes and revision numbers, and the names of the officers who had approved each subsequent draft. This file had none of that. Just 43 pages of dense tactical notation, diagrams, resource allocation tables, and at the very end, a single handwritten line in the margin of the last page that the translation system flagged as ambiguous. She read the translation 3 times. For whoever finds this. Not if you find this. Not to our enemies. Not a rallying cry, not a threat, not a final defiant declaration from a defeated soldier. For whoever finds this. Sevan stared at those 3 words for a long time. Then she called her superior. Executor Dronvel, she said carefully when the connection opened. I think we may need to read this very slowly. The Dominion had been at war with humanity for 14 months by then, and the consensus among the High Command was that it would be over in 4 more. This was not arrogance, it was mathematics. The Dominion spanned 47 star systems. They had been a spacefaring civilization for 900 years. Their fleet numbered in the thousands of ships, their soldiers in the tens of millions, and their tactical doctrine had been refined across 38 separate military engagements against 11 different species. They had never lost a war. They had come close once, against the Vreth Collective, but even that had ended in Dominion victory after a campaign of measured, methodical pressure that had taken 6 years, and produced exactly the outcome their war planning algorithms had predicted to within a margin of 3%. Humans had been spacefaring for 60 years. They had 1 inhabited star system, 11 colonies at various stages of development, and a military that the Dominion's intelligence division had assessed as tactically creative but structurally fragile. The initial engagement, when it came, had gone almost exactly as projected. 3 human colonies fell in the first 2 months. A 4th was blockaded into surrender a month after that. And then things began to go slightly, persistently, inexplicably wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Nothing dramatic enough to force a reassessment. Just wrong in ways that accumulated. A supply line disrupted in a sector where no human ships should have been operating. A Dominion garrison on a captured world that went silent for 6 hours and when they reported back in, couldn't account for the gap. A patrol vessel that detected a human scout craft, gave chase for 40 minutes, and then lost it in a debris field that, upon later analysis, the scout craft could not possibly have navigated at the speed it was traveling. Each incident had an explanation. The supply line disruption was attributed to a navigation miscalculation that had created an unexpected collision. The garrison's silence was electromagnetic interference from a nearby solar event. The scout craft had almost certainly been destroyed in the debris field, and the sensor readings suggesting it survived were probably instrument error. Probably was the word that had begun to follow Executor Dronvel everywhere he went. And now his archivist was calling him about a document that began with no title and ended with a handwritten note that read like an invitation. He reviewed the file himself that evening, read all 43 pages, then read them again. This is their battle plan, he said slowly. Yes, Executor. For the defense of their inner systems. Yes. Which we haven't yet reached. Correct. He set the document down on his desk and looked at Sevian across the secure channel. She was a small creature by Dominion standards, careful and precise, with the kind of methodical intelligence that had made her useful in intelligence analysis. He had always thought of her as someone incapable of being unnerved. She looked unnerved now. They knew we would raid Kepler's Reach, he said. The timeline suggests they had at least 72 hours of warning, yes. And they left this for us to find. Left it, she said. Executor, the document wasn't hidden. It was in the open on the primary command terminal. It had been printed. The printing timestamp shows it was produced 4 hours before our strike team arrived. Dronvel said nothing. They printed it, Sevian said again, as though repetition might make it make sense. Physical copy, left on a terminal, in a base they knew we were going to raid, with no title, and a handwritten note at the end that they wrote for us. He picked up the document again, turned to the last page, read the 3 words one more time. What does the battle plan actually say? That's the other thing I needed to discuss with you, sir. The battle plan described, in extraordinary detail, the exact defensive posture humanity intended to adopt for the protection of their 3 remaining core systems. It specified fleet positions, patrol routes, supply chain logistics, the location of secondary ammunition caches, communication relay positions, and, most remarkably, the psychological state of the human military command structure, including which admirals were under stress, which were performing well, and what decisions they were likely to make under pressure. It was, in other words, everything the Dominion could have wanted. Dronvel convened an emergency session of tactical command within 24 hours. The debate lasted 9 hours and produced no consensus, which was itself unprecedented. One faction believed the document was genuine intelligence. Humans, under pressure, had made an error, printed a sensitive file, been forced to evacuate before they could destroy it, and the raiding team had found what the humans desperately wished had burned. This faction argued for immediately exploiting the tactical data. A second faction argued the document was deliberate disinformation. The defensive positions were too well described. The information was too complete. No real battle plan gave this level of psychological profile of its own commanders. It was a trap, and the correct move was to identify what the humans actually wanted them to do with this information, and then do something else entirely. A third faction, smaller, quieter, led by Sevian herself, though she had no official place at the tactical table, argued something that the other 2 factions found difficult to engage with seriously. She argued that the document might be both. Both, Dronvel had repeated, in the tone of a man trying to be patient. Both genuine and intended to be found, she said. What if the defensive plan is completely real, accurately describes exactly what the humans intend to do, and was also written with the assumption that we would read it? The room had gone quiet in a way that had nothing to do with respect, and everything to do with discomfort. That would imply, said Fleet Admiral Koros Don, from the head of the table, that they have written a defense plan that works even if we know about it in advance. Yes, said Sevian, that's exactly what that would imply. She requested 3 days to analyze the document before any tactical decision was made. She got 2. She spent 47 of the available 48 hours awake, working with a translation specialist named Voss and a human cultural analyst named, in Dominion rendering, Pale Second Season, who had spent 8 years studying human civilization before the war and whose expertise had been largely dismissed since the conflict began because, as Fleet Admiral Korosdon had put it at the start of the campaign, understanding a species and defeating one are different disciplines. Pale Second Season had not spoken at a tactical briefing in 4 months. She brought him in on the 2nd hour. Tell me about the handwritten note, she said. He looked at the scan of the document for a long moment. His species communicated primarily through color shift in their secondary membranes. And right now, every visible surface of him had gone a specific shade that Sevian had learned, in 8 years of working with him, meant something between "I've been waiting for someone to ask me that, and I am afraid of the answer I'm about to give you." "It's not defiant," he said. "I know. Human military farewells to enemies are almost always defiant, or contemptuous, or both. This is," he looked at the note again. "This is asterisk considerate, the phrasing. For whoever finds this, it's a gift framing. In human cultural context, you write for someone when you're giving them something they need, not something they want, something you've determined they need." Sevan felt the slow movement of something cold through the primary fluid of her circulatory system. "They think we need this," she said. "I think," said Pale Second Season carefully, "that they wrote this document with a very specific reader in mind. And I think the reader they had in mind was not an archivist or a general. I think they wrote it for whoever in the Dominion's command structure was going to make the final decision about how to proceed." "Why?" He set the document down. "Because the plan works. I've been looking at it for the last hour. The defensive posture is it's not what I expected. Given their resources, their numbers, the state of their fleet after the losses at Kepler's Reach, I would have predicted a concentrated defense at their most populated world, sacrificing the outer two. Instead, they've distributed, thinned. They've made themselves look weaker at every individual point in exchange for maintaining presence everywhere." He paused. "That's not a desperation tactic. That's deliberate. Fleet Admiral Korosdan will say it confirms they don't have the numbers to consolidate." "Fleet Admiral Korosdan," said Pale Second Season, in the careful tone of someone who had spent 4 months being told his expertise was irrelevant, "will be wrong." He was wrong. The Tactical Council voted 8-3 to exploit the battle plan. Fleet Admiral Korosdan, confident in the intelligence windfall, ordered a 3-pronged advance on humanity's inner systems, striking simultaneously at the positions the document described as lightly defended, aiming to split the distributed human fleet before it could consolidate. The advance launched 60 hours after the document's analysis period concluded. Sevan was in the intelligence center when the first reports came back. She had stayed awake for that too, though by this point she had lost count of consecutive sleepless hours. The first strike force reached its target and found nothing. Empty space where the human patrol routes had been specified. No ships, no defensive installations. The secondary ammunition cache locations were accurate, but empty, stripped clean within the last 48 hours, the forensic analysis suggested, judging by the residual energy signatures. The second strike force met resistance exactly where the document said there would be none. A cluster of human vessels, not a fleet, not even a large formation, but precisely positioned at a gravitational lensing point that made them appear, on long-range sensors, like a formation 3 times their actual size. The strike force commander, uncertain of the numbers he was facing, called for reinforcement before engaging. The reinforcement request pulled ships from the third strike corridor. The third corridor, now thinned, was hit by a human force that materialized from what should have been empty space, a debris field that the Dominion's charts listed as non-navigable. The same kind of debris field that a human scout craft had seemingly impossibly navigated 11 months ago. Sevan read the after-action reports with a feeling she had no specific word for in her own language, so she found herself reaching for the human one she'd learned from Pale Second Season. Vertigo. The sensation of the ground being somewhere other than where you expected. She called him immediately. "The plan was accurate," she said. "Everything in it was accurate. The fleet positions, the patrol routes, the cache locations, all of it was exactly right. And we still lost." "Yes," he said. "How?" There was a long pause on the channel. When he spoke again, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. "Because the document described what they were planning to do," he said. "It did not describe what they were going to do once they knew we had read it." She went back to the document that night. All 43 pages. Read them the way she would read a text in a language she only partially understood, looking not just at what was said but at what was chosen, what was included, what was, perhaps deliberately, absent. The battle plan described human fleet positions. It did not describe human decision-making logic. It described supply routes. It did not describe what the humans intended to do when those routes were compromised, only where the routes were. It described the psychological profiles of human admirals under current conditions, not future conditions. She turned to the last page for the 100th time, the handwritten note for whoever finds this. And for the first time, the chill she felt was not confusion, it was recognition. The document wasn't a battle plan for fighting the Dominion. It was a battle plan for teaching the Dominion. Every piece of real information in it was real precisely because the humans needed the Dominion to trust it, to rely on it, so that when the Dominion acted on that information, the humans would know exactly what the Dominion was going to do. 43 pages of accurate intelligence, handed over voluntarily, not to mislead, but to predict, to make the Dominion's response legible. The battle plan was written for them. The humans had written a document that functioned as a mirror, and the Dominion had looked into it and seen a gift, and acted accordingly, and in acting accordingly had become exactly as predictable as the humans needed them to be. She sat with this understanding for a very long time. Then she found the piece she'd been missing. Page 31. Resource allocation tables. Third column. The numbers described convoy schedules for human supply runs between their inner systems, routes and timings that any competent attacker would use to plan interdiction strikes. She'd looked at this page before and dismissed it as operational detail. Now she looked at the specific commodities listed and the quantities and the timestamps of the projected runs. The quantities were wrong. Not wrong in the way that errors were wrong. Wrong in the way that a statement is wrong when it's precisely calibrated to communicate something other than what it appears to say. The convoy runs listed were 3 times larger than humanity's known production capacity for those materials. She had the production figures in a separate intelligence file, compiled over months. She pulled them up now, compared them, looked at the gap between what the document claimed humanity could supply and what humanity could, based on every piece of reliable intelligence the Dominion had, actually produce. The gap was enormous, and the gap was consistent across every resource category in the table, which meant one of two things. Either the humans had manufacturing capacity the Dominion had never detected, which was possible but would require infrastructure hidden so completely that it beggared belief, or the convoy runs in the document were designed to show the Dominion a resource picture that would make them believe the humans had far more material endurance than they actually possessed. She went very still. For whoever finds this, they weren't just predicting the Dominion's response. They were extending it, making the Dominion believe this war would last longer than it would, making the Dominion pace themselves, hold back, calculate their advances based on an enemy with greater remaining capacity than they actually had, making the Dominion slow down. But why would you want the enemy to slow down if you were losing? Unless slowing the enemy wasn't the objective. Unless the objective was something that required time, not for the humans to build more ships, not to wait for reinforcement that wasn't coming, but to do something else entirely. Something that took months. Something that the Dominion, in all their analysis, had not been looking for because they had been too busy looking at the battle plan they were given to look at anything else. Seven's hands were shaking slightly, a physical response she had not experienced in years. She called Pale Second Season again. It was the middle of the Dominion sleep cycle, and his response was delayed, his color patterns indicating interrupted rest. But when he saw her face on the channel, his membranes shifted immediately to attention. "They're not fighting for time to survive," she said without preamble. "They're fighting for time to finish something." He went very still. "What are they building?" she said. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. "I think," he said slowly, "that's the question they've been hoping we wouldn't ask." She brought her full analysis to Dronvel at dawn. He listened in silence. He was not a stupid creature. She had always respected that about him, and she could see in the set of his features that he was following every step of the reasoning without needing it repeated or defended. What she saw in his face when she finished was not skepticism. It was something she had not expected. It was resignation. "You're describing a strategy," he said, "that required them to lose Kepler's reach." "Yes, required them to be raided." "The document was printed 4 hours before our strike team arrived," she said. "They knew the timeline within 4 hours. They couldn't have known the exact timing of the raid." "No, but they knew a raid was coming, and they printed that document and left it on a terminal, and somewhere in their command structure, someone spent hours writing a 43-page document that they knew I would receive, knowing I would read it, knowing it would take me far too long to understand it." She paused. "They also knew that by the time I understood it, the Tactical Council would have already acted. They knew how we process intelligence. They knew our command structure moves faster than our analysis does. They knew we would exploit the information before we fully interrogated it." Dronvel was quiet for a very long time. "I made the decision," he said, "to act within the analysis window." "Yes." He looked at the document on her desk, at the last page, at 3 words in a human hand that had been written. She now understood, with a very specific reader in mind, and that reader had never been an archivist, had never been a general, had been precisely and exactly the creature sitting across from her now. "What are they building?" he asked. "I don't know," she said, "but I know they need 4 more months. The false resource figures the way they're inflated. The pattern only makes sense if they're padding for a specific timeline. 4 months from the raid on Kepler's reach, which means 2 months from now." His voice had changed, something that might in another context have been called fear. "We need to find what they're building," she said, "not by looking at their military, by looking at where they've deliberately directed our attention away from." "You're saying this entire campaign?" "The raids we conducted, the systems we occupied, the patrol routes we prioritized based on intelligence we thought we'd captured." She spread the 43 pages across the desk between them. "Every move we've made since acquiring this document has been calibrated by this document. We have been moving exactly as they needed us to move. Not where they needed us to move, but when asterisk and in what sequence, and with exactly the distribution of force that ensures that whatever they're working on in the places we haven't looked." She stopped. "We handed them our predictability. We handed it to them with 8 votes in a room." Dronvel stood slowly. "I need to convene the full council." "Executor," her voice stopped him. "Before you do, there's one more thing." She turned to page 31 again. "The resource tables, the impossible quantities. The convoy runs they describe, the inflated ones, they're not random inflation. The numbers are too specific for random error. Someone chose these exact figures, and when I ran a comparison to known human industrial output and calculated backwards from the surplus," she pointed to a figure in the 3rd column. "This number, this precise surplus quantity, it appears in human mathematical literature as a load-bearing figure in a specific class of energy calculation." Pale Second Season had found this in the final hour of her analysis. She hadn't slept since. "What kind of energy calculation?" said Dronvel. She told him. He left the room without responding. She heard him in the outer corridor, opening a channel to the full council with a priority designation she had only seen used twice in her career. She sat alone with the document, all 43 pages, the handwritten note at the end. For whoever finds this. She had thought when she first read it that it was an invitation. Now she understood what kind. The humans called the device threshold. The Dominion learned this later, much later, along with most of the other things they hadn't been meant to know until it was too late to matter. The project had begun 14 months ago, simultaneous with the opening of hostilities. Not before. Not in response to the war's early disasters, not as a desperate pivot after the fall of the first colonies. Precisely simultaneous. Which meant someone in the human military command had looked at the Dominion's fleet strength, their technological advantage, their centuries of accumulated tactical doctrine, and had made a calculation that most rational civilizations, faced with those numbers, would never have made, because most rational civilizations would have looked at the math and recognized that there was no version of conventional warfare in which humanity won. The humans had not attempted to solve that problem. They had decided that if the conventional path was closed, they would build a door. Threshold was, in essence, a weapon designed to render the Dominion's greatest tactical advantage inert. Not destroy it, not outmatch it. Simply switch it off across every Dominion communication relay in the occupied territories, simultaneously, for a duration of approximately 90 seconds. 90 seconds of total communication blackout across 47 Dominion star systems was, by the calculations of every military strategist who later analyzed it, sufficient to create a cascading confusion event from which a fleet that had been operating as a unified organism would take, conservatively, 3 hours to recover. During which time a species that had spent 14 months being shepherded into exactly the right distribution of force, in exactly the right locations, guided by a document that had made the Dominion's response as legible as a printed page. 3 hours. 3 hours was what the humans needed. They had planned for exactly 3 hours. Seven was in the intelligence center when Threshold activated. The first sign was not a sound or a sensor reading. It was silence. Every open communication channel going quiet simultaneously, not static, not interference, just absence. A silence so complete it had a physical quality like pressure equalizing. She knew what it was before anyone told her. She had known for 6 days, since her final analysis of the document, since the thing she had told Dronvel and watched his face change. She had known this was coming, and knowing had not made her feel prepared. Around her, the intelligence center erupted. Analysts cycling between dead channels, calling for technical support that couldn't be reached because technical support was on a channel that didn't exist anymore. Someone shouted about a hardware failure. Someone else proposed a solar event. These were the same explanations that had followed every inexplicable incident in the last 14 months. And for the first time, Seven felt something almost like grief for how consistently they had chosen the comfortable explanation over the correct one. "It's not the hardware," she said, and the room went quiet because she was the Archivist Prime and she was calm in a way that was more frightening than panic. "And it's not a solar event. This is going to last 90 seconds. After that, the channels will return, and we will have approximately 3 hours. 3 hours until what?" someone asked. She looked at the blank display where the communication feeds had been. "Until they show us what they were building the whole time we were reading their battle plan." 37 seconds of silence. Then 40. Then a voice from across the room. "Why 90 seconds? Why not longer?" Seven almost said "I don't know," because she didn't, not for certain. But then she did know, in the way that you sometimes arrive at a truth not through analysis but through accumulation, through having spent enough time thinking like the people you're studying that their logic becomes briefly, uncomfortably legible. "Because 90 seconds is all they need," she said. Because this entire time, we've been thinking about what they need to survive long enough to use this weapon. We haven't been thinking about what the weapon actually does to us. 90 seconds of blackout across the occupied territories doesn't hurt us strategically. It doesn't destroy our fleet. It gives us a shock and 3 hours of confusion. She paused. But every garrison commander in every territory we've occupied, 3 hours without contact from high command, with human forces suddenly moving, every one of them is going to have to make a decision about whether to hold or retreat without orders, without coordination, without knowing what any other garrison is doing. She turned to the map of occupied territories on the display wall. 38 stars, 11 of them formerly human colonies. They're not going to destroy our fleet, she said. They're going to give every occupied planet 3 hours of freedom while our commanders make 38 separate, uncoordinated decisions, and some of them will hold and some of them will pull back, and when the channels come back the territories won't be what they were. Her voice was very quiet now. The humans don't need to beat us. They need to make us beat ourselves. 67 seconds. Then 73. A young analyst named Russon, who had been in the center for less than a year and who had never seen a conflict before this one, looked up from a dead console and said, "They've been losing for 14 months. "Yes," said Sutherland. "They lost Kupla's reach. They lost 4 colonies. He stopped. Were any of those losses real, or were all of them?" "The losses were real," she said. "People died. Worlds fell. That's the part I couldn't let myself look at too clearly until now, because if you look at it directly," she stopped too. "They lost real things, chose to lose them, needed us to believe we were winning so that we would keep moving where the plan needed us to be. And someone in their command structure looked at a list of what would have to be sacrificed to make that work, and they..." She couldn't finish the sentence. She thought about the human admirals in the document, the psychological profiles, the notes about who was under stress. She had thought those notes were intelligence. Now she understood they were something else, a kind of record, a testament. Someone had described those officers honestly, fully, the way you describe people you care about. Their stresses, their strengths, their ways of making decisions under pressure. Written into a document designed to be captured and read by the enemy. Making the human commanders legible, making them human. For whoever finds this. 88 seconds. 89. The channels came back. And the Dominion High Command found itself looking at a map that had changed in 90 seconds more profoundly than it had in 14 months of war. The document was studied for years afterward. Military historians, Dominion and human both, later, in the strange and deeply uncomfortable diplomatic exchange of analysis that followed the end of the conflict, identified 43 separate embedded layers of information in the 43 pages. Not all of them were tactical. Some were linguistic. Some were mathematical. Some appeared to have been written purely for specific structural choices in the analysis sections that would only make sense to a Dominion intelligence officer, trained in the particular school of pattern recognition that she had been trained in, as though whoever wrote the document had reviewed Dominion archival methodology, specifically to calibrate what she would notice and what she would overlook. She never found out who had written it. The human military classified that information, and the request to declassify it, submitted by Sutherland personally, years after the war, was done 3 times. The denial letters were polite. They were not explanatory. The third one included, at the bottom, handwritten, a single line. She had the letter on her desk when she died, 40 years later. She had read the handwritten note more times than she had read almost anything else in her career. She had discussed it with Pale Second Season, who outlived her by 11 years and spent most of those years trying to explain humans to institutions that believed they understood them now and were, he maintained to the last, catastrophically wrong. She had shown it to Drun Vol, who had retired from military service 2 years after the war and had never spoken publicly about the campaign. He had looked at the note for a long time when she showed him. He had not offered an interpretation. He had simply handed the letter back and said, in the voice of a creature who had spent 2 years sitting with something he couldn't put down, "They knew it would end this way." She had never been sure if he meant the war, or the note, or something larger. The handwritten line at the bottom of the third declassification denial read, "You already have everything you need to understand us. You've had it since Kupla's reach. The question was never whether you could read the document. The question was whether you could believe that a species would write it." Savan had thought, when she first found the document, that for whoever finds this was a gift framing, a species giving something to an enemy they determined needed it. 40 years of thinking about it, and she was still not sure she was wrong, but she had come to understand that she had msaduntuffed the gift. It wasn't the battle plan. The battle plan was the envelope. The logistics, the fleet positions, the psychological profiles, the false convoy numbers, all of it was just the delivery mechanism. The gift was the last page, the handwritten note. 3 words chosen with the same care that had gone into every other word in 43 pages of precisely calibrated intelligence, chosen not to deceive or mislead, but to say directly to whatever mind eventually held this document and understood it. "We saw you. We knew you. We planned for you specifically. We made something that worked because we understood you well enough to predict what you would do with it." That was what they had given the Dominion. Not a weapon, not a trap, a mirror and the knowledge that someone on the other side had been watching clearly enough to build one. The Dominion spent years debating whether that should terrify them. Savan spent 40 years being certain that it should. Not because the humans had won. Civilizations won wars. That was survivable, understandable, a thing that fit inside known categories of conflict and resolution. What the humans had done was different. They had not simply won. They had written a document that worked, designed a plan that functioned even when fully disclosed to the enemy, built a strategy that used the enemy's intelligence gathering against them, that converted the Dominion's analytical capability into a steering mechanism, that turned 900 years of accumulated tactical doctrine into a set of predictable responses that a species with 60 years of spusflut had catalogued and exploited, and written 43 pages to activate. They were not the most powerful species the Dominion had ever faced. They were the only species the Dominion had ever faced who had looked at a 900-year military civilization and responded not with despair or defiance or desperate innovation, but with something that most rational minds, Dominion, Vruth, human or otherwise, would have recognized as insane, because it required a species to trust that understanding an enemy deeply enough was a form of strength that outweighed every disadvantage in ships, technology, and numbers. It required a species to sit down and write, with full knowledge of what the war was costing them, a 43-page document for a reader they had never met and would never know, trusting that the reader would eventually reach the last page, read 3 handwritten words, and understand, not what the humans were planning, not what they were capable of, but what they were willing to do. That was the part that stayed with Sutherland. That was the part she could not set down. Long after the conflict, long after the treaties and the analysis and the careful diplomatic reconstruction of what had happened and why, the question that every Dominion strategist kept returning to was whether it could be countered. Whether, knowing what they knew now, the Dominion could have read that document and responded differently. The consensus was yes, theoretically, with perfect information and different institutional incentives and a command structure that moved slower than its analysis, instead of faster, theoretically, yes. But that was the point that Savan had been trying to make for 40 years, to anyone who would listen. To students and analysts and commanders who nodded and filed the lesson, and continued to move faster than their analysis, because that was what 900 years of successful warfare had trained them to do. The document hadn't exploited a mistake. It had exploited a strength. And somewhere, she had always suspected, someone in the human command structure had understood that the most dangerous thing you can do to a civilization that has never lost is to write them a letter that reveals, in perfect detail, exactly how you plan to beat them, and have them read it and understand it, and still not be able to stop it from working, because the weapon was never the plan. The weapon was the knowledge that you had been understood, and that you had been found wanting. Not in strength, not in technology, not in numbers or doctrine or accumulated centuries of military refinement. In imagination. The Dominion had been unable to imagine a species that would choose to lose 4 colonies, sacrifice Kepler's reach, document their own commander's psychological fragility, inflate their resource figures with a precise mathematical signature pointing toward a weapon's energy calculation, and hand all of it to the enemy, not despite the cost, but because of it. Because a species that can pay that price without stopping is not a species that can be predicted by modeling what a rational civilization would sacrifice. The humans had spent 14 months losing in ways they could afford, in order to win in a way the Dominion couldn't imagine. That was what Seven's letter said in the end, written in the margin of a 40-year-old denial letter, in the careful hand of an archivist who had spent a career learning to read between lines, who had been given the document that changed everything and had almost understood it in time. They are not the strongest species in the galaxy. They are the species willing to continue long after every rational civilization would stop, and to document carefully, in 43 pages, exactly why that makes them impossible to defeat. I read the whole document. I understood it eventually. It worked anyway. That's what they wanted me to know. She set down her pen. The letter sat on the desk in the quiet of her office, in the last year of her life, in a building on a world that had once been occupied and was no longer. Outside somewhere, the humans were still writing. She had never